Say, hey, Charlie. Okay, I wanted to hop on here and discuss something that came across me last night. I was watching a podcast, and this person was talking about they were currently going through rehab, and he said something that really made me have a different outlook on people going through weed addiction. He felt like he didn't belong in there because people had took their addiction much further than what he had. He realized he did not have as big an issue because he was extremely self-aware early in the process. And I was thinking it's very good for us to be self-aware. And this made me think about people who do have weed addiction, as people say, because you say you have weed addiction, they say, "Oh, it's you're just weak. It's just weed. Just quit." Which again, I'm beating a dead horse. I feel like weed is harder to quit because there's no health. There's not any obvious health hazards. It doesn't send your life into a spiral. You won't go extremely broken. Sell your mother's wedding ring for it. So we tend to and it makes us laugh, makes us sleep, helps us sleep. So we tend to smoke weed for a long period of time and ignore it being an addictive thing. But when you say I want to quit and I can't quit, people say, "Oh, you're just weak. It's just weed." And maybe I've had that outlook as well a few times, but then that made me think. Also a comment about a month ago, somebody said that you're struggling with weed addiction. Oh, I've been on heroin, I've been on this. You haven't lived enough life, and that still has not set well with me because I don't know what that means. That I need to do harder drugs to know about life. But it made me think people who recognize they have a issue with weed addiction before it gets to other drugs or alcohol, maybe we, I, you are extremely self-aware, and that's a good thing. We may feel like, "Oh, am I weak-minded because I want to quit something like weed?" Maybe we should reframe it to, no, actually, I am extremely self-aware. I can recognize an issue before it gets to me being on the streets, being a crackhead, being on harder drugs. I can recognize something in its baby stages. So it's not necessarily weak wanting to quit weed, or you find it hard to quit weed, or you recognize you should quit. Because I feel like, with weed, if you really want to quit, although it may take you tries, it may not come as easy for some. If you want to quit, eventually you will quit weed. And you should pat yourself on the back and not look at it like, maybe I'm just weak, or like, why am I so lame that I want to quit weed? But you are extremely self-aware of a pattern you see before it gets to the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth level. Being self-aware is so good. We shouldn't be so self-aware that we're so self-conscious that it's actually preventing us from going out there, pursuing relationships, pursuing things, because we're so scared of what people may think of us, or how we may appear. But being self-aware of your actions, of your emotions, how things are affecting you, is a great thing. And people who realize they do have a weed addiction issue early on, maybe you're just extremely self-aware of yourself, and that is a good thing. So just briefly, instead of thinking of you being weak for wanting to quit weed, think of it as, no, I'm very self-aware. I recognize an issue before it has gotten to rock bottom, and I'm going to change it now. So a little quick motivation that was kind of a eye opener for me to look at weed addiction from another viewpoint. So until next time, guys, like, subscribe, share. Most importantly, we are all in this together. Peace. It can affect your relationship with sleep. A lot of times we'll start smoking weed because we'll say, "It'll help me with sleep. I can't sleep at night. I have insomnia. I stay up all night thinking." And in the beginning can turn our minds off, allow us to get drowsy, allow us to get groggy. So we use it as a sleep aid, which I'm not going to argue that. But I believe the problem is when we start to depend on using weed as a sleep aid. Now, weed is medicinal, but it's medicinal meaning it should be used for a short period of time to help you get over whatever you're going through. So we shouldn't take sleeping pills our whole life. We shouldn't smoke weed our whole life as a sleep aid. And also I've heard that with studies, the longer you use weed, it can have the reverse effect. So maybe in the beginning when you were using weed to, let's say, help you sleep, the more you use it, you actually start to get a poor quality of sleep. So you can fall asleep easy, but you're not actually going into the REM cycle of sleep. You're not dreaming. That's why when people quit, a big side effect is having vivid or wild or nightmares or strange dreams, because your body isn't used to going into that deep REM cycle of sleep. So the longer you use weed, again, you get a poor quality of sleep. If you can't go to sleep at night, there's a reason why. It's not because you just can't sleep. Maybe you're worried about something. Maybe you're anxious. Maybe you have other issues that you need to seek a sleep specialist to help you out with that. But don't just go your whole life smoking weed at night because I can't sleep. So you may battle with CHS. Now this doesn't affect everybody who smokes weed, but a lot of users tend to suffer with CHS, which is also known as cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So basically, weed makes you throw up. The weed messes with the cannabinoid receptors in your brain, in your esophagus, and it gets all twisted and confused, making your esophagus tighten up, making you throw up your food. Now, this can range from extremely severe to extremely light. I myself had a very light case. I experienced it around about, say, 3 or 4 times, maybe 5 in 15 years. But some people experience this actually every day. And there are even some, it only actually affects you when you smoke weed for a extended period of time. And also, it's common to also happen immediately after you stop smoking weed for a brief period of time. But whatever the case, if weed is causing you to throw up every day or frequently or even at all, that's a good sign that you should quit weed. Because honestly, who wants to go around with throw up breath and tarnished teeth due to puke? That's quite disgusting. It affects your relationship with food. Now, this one was a big one for me. The longer you smoke weed, the more weed intertwines itself with your appetite. I was to the point where I was not hungry unless I smoked weed. I had to smoke before I ate, and I like to smoke after I ate. And before I knew it, I was depending on weed to actually eat. And when we start to depend on weed to determine other areas in our life, weed has kind of taken control over our lives unexpectedly. So before I actually quit, I was scared to quit because I felt like if I quit weed, I'm not going to get hungry and I'm going to lose weight. I'm already skinny, so I couldn't afford to lose any weight. But the good thing about weed is the side effects after you quit, the withdrawals only last for a short period of time. So after about a week or 2, I gained my normal appetite back. But if weed is affecting how you eat, when you want to eat, you probably should quit. And also, weed can affect the type of food you eat. You're not going to get high and want to eat a salad. Okay, some people may want a salad, but normally if you get high, you want some McDonald's, some junk food, some chips, some Zuzu, some chicken, some chicken nuggets, whatever the case. Once I actually quit weed, I was more prone to eat healthy. So I was surprised on how weed not only affected how I ate, but actually what I ate. It affects your relationship with money. Now, in this time of recession, inflation, whatever, shit is high, and weed is high as well. What you could get for $30 2, 3, 4, or 5 years ago, you can't get that now. So if you're trying to save money, you're trying to budget yourself, quitting weed is probably beneficial to you. I'm surprised to see how many people actually spend a lot of money on weed. I would say at my highest, I would spend $100 a week on weed, and people come in and say, "Oh, lucky you, that's more than what I spend." And I'm like, okay, I wouldn't brag on that. I would try to quit because that's too much money to be spending on weed. But there's nothing wrong with buying weed every now and then. It's not costing you a whole lot. But when it comes a part of your weekly, your daily, your monthly budget, before you know it, you have spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on weed. Not to count cigars, pipes, bones, whatever the case. Weed is very expensive. Some people may say, it's not expensive as narcotics or heroin or other drugs. True, but it's still expensive. Eggs is not expensive as caviar, but eggs are still expensive. I would challenge you to actually write down how much money you spent a week on weed. Calculate that by 4. Calculate that by 12. And let's say you smoke 5, 10, 15 years. I'm sure the amount of money you have spent on weed in that time will shock you. It shocked me, so I'm sure it'll shock you. Okay, it stagnates your life. Most people like to say, "Oh, I can smoke weed and go to work and pursue my career and do everything and be a great person while I smoke weed." Now, I'm not going to say it's impossible to do everything in your life while you smoke weed. But the danger in smoking weed is it can secretly make you stay in a certain position. For instance, if you deal with anxiety, I would say, what do you have anxiety about? You have anxiety about where you are in your career, where you are in your relationships. When you smoke weed, what it does is it eases your anxiety. You don't necessarily solve the problem. It makes you feel better about the problem. And I would say, if you can do good things in life or live a decent life while you're smoking weed, think how great you could be if you weren't smoking weed. And if you say, "I won't be better if I don't smoke weed," I would reassess your mindset. I like to run. When I quit weed, I had no intention of running. I wasn't be like, "I quit weed, now I'll run." But I was surprised on how many areas in my life was stagnated because I was smoking weed without me knowing it. But I guarantee you, if you quit weed, you will find out it's things in your life that you maybe haven't pursued that weed was subconsciously holding you back from. So in actuality, it's preventing you from actually solving your problem and staying in a certain position in life. A lot of times anxiety is good because it lets you know that you should be worried about something. You should want to change something. But when you smoke weed, you say, life isn't a big deal. It's not a big deal. I can get to it when I want to. And you don't actually pursue change. Okay, the effects start to diminish. Now, we know when we first start smoking weed, when we're young, we get high, we get the munchies, we laugh, we trip. It's all a fun time, but the more you smoke, the longer you smoke, the effects start to wear off. So after a while, you've been smoking for 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you pretty much just smoke weed like you drink water. You no longer really get high unless you just smoke a whole lot of weed. But on average, just smoking your daily normal amount, you're just smoking to be a normal person. So when you get to a point where you're smoking weed just to live and you're not even getting the full effects of being high, what's the point of actually smoking? And this is very more so common if you start smoking at a very young age. So let's say you start smoking when you're about 16. So when you get to the age of 25 or 30, you've been smoking for 15 plus years.
you no longer get the same effects you got when you first start smoking. So where you may use weed to help you sleep, to ease your anxiety, to ease your depression, the more you smoke, it doesn't have the same effect. Actually, I've heard in regards to sleep, people may tend to use weed to help them sleep, but after years of use, it actually has the reverse effect of sleep. So you actually start to get a more poor quality of sleep. So the longer you use weed, either it diminishes the effects or the good effects start reversing. You can also take a tolerance break. You know, it was weird when I when I would not smoke for about a week or two, and I would smoke again. The effects would come back at a stronger rate. Actually, it was weird. I would start to feel like, as far as anxiety, we use weed for a long period of time to ease your anxiety, to make you act normal. But if you actually take a tolerance break for like some weeks or a month, when you come back to weed, even at a small amount, it didn't really ease my anxiety. It gave me anxiety. I started to feel like I was when I was 16, whereas when I was younger, you smoke a couple blunts, you can't go anywhere because you're zooted, you're totally buzzed. You know, you can't actually go out in public. And the longer you smoke, you know, like I said, it's like you're just smoking, like you're drinking a beverage, so you can do your daily tasks and smoke weed. But after that tolerance break, it actually gave me more anxiety by being high. So I guess maybe, depending on who you are, you may think that's a good thing, because, you know, you can feel the effects. Like, I did not want to be 35 feeling like 16-year-old pothead. That was weird. It can lead to addiction. Now, surprisingly, weed is a very controversial drug. Some say it's addictive, some say it's not, some say you can just quit. I think weed is addictive, and it can be arguably the most addictive because it's the most acceptable. It's also the lesser of all drugs. It's medicinal. It is medicinal. It doesn't tear your life apart. It doesn't have you spiraling. You can smoke weed for a long period of time and it not show on the outside. Therefore, it can tend to be actually more addictive than something like narcotics or alcohol. But when you get to a point when you have to smoke every day, when you wake up you have to smoke, when you eat you have to smoke, when you sleep you have to smoke, you have to deal with people, you have to smoke, deal with your kids, deal with your wife, yada yada yada. It's addictive. It has become ingrained in every aspect of your life. And to say that people don't have an issue trying to quit weed is pretty naive. But I will say weed can be very deceptive, and I was always the one, like many potheads would say, that I can quit anytime I want to, but I just don't want to quit. Don't let weed fool you. If you've been smoking for 5, 10, 15 plus years, you probably are very well addicted to weed. And when you have tried to quit or went on a tolerance break or just couldn't get any because your weed man is out of pocket, you have found your day to get quite hard to get through. When you got to that point, then it is addictive. Some might say that it's mentally addictive, not physical. Therefore, it's not addictive. Everything starts mental before it becomes physical. When somebody is drinking alcohol, it doesn't immediately become physical. They first have to think or want in their mind that they want to drink tonight. After years of use, it becomes physical. But weed is just mental, non-stop. So don't let weed fool you. Weed is definitely addictive, and do not fall into the cycle of weed addiction if you don't want to.
Take me to the mall. Take me to the mall.
Okay, most of us who have smoked weed our whole entire life has probably never ever researched its origins. So I want to go back as far as possible to trace the origins of cannabis to see how we ended up here today, addicted to weed.
Take me to the
Now, when I was trying to research when it actually started or when we first were introduced to weed, I kept on getting contradicting years. Some say it's 1 billion years, some say it's 28 billion years, some say it's 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 28,000. But just in my personal opinion, anytime they say it's 28 million years, I kind of shrug my shoulders because I'm like, I don't believe I don't believe in this whole 28 million billion years ago, because like, if this is as far as we gotten in 1 billion years, we suck as a human race. So just to be logical, we'll say our first intro to weed was back in 2800 BC in the Asian dynasty. They say weed probably either started in Central Asia or Western China. In most cases, weed was originally used for its medicinal purpose. It was listed in Emperor Shen Nung's Pharmacopoeia. He was regarded as the father of Chinese medicine. They say in most cases it was probably used for health causes such as arthritis, inflammation, hunger, depression, lack of appetite, asthma, etc. It can also be traced back to India. Hindu legend holds that Shiva, the supreme godhead of many sects, was known as the Lord of Bhang because the cannabis plant was one of his favorite foods. The ancient Hindus thought that the medicinal properties of cannabis was explained by pleasing the gods such as Shiva. Ancient Hindu text states that the onset of fever was from the hot breath of the gods, who was angered by the afflicted person's behavior. Using the cannabis in this religious rites, in many cases they believe it pleased the gods, and in turn he reduced their fever. Interesting, weed, they do say if you smoke it, it lowers your fever. So they then thought the fever was lowered because the god Shiva lowered your fever. Hemp is also called ganja, and we actually got the word ganja from Indian culture, or Sanskrit or other Indo-Aryan languages. Some scholars suggest that the ancient drug soma mentioned in the Vedas was cannabis, although that theory is sometimes disputed. But banga, the mixture of milk and cannabis, is mentioned in several religious texts. But there is a philological debate among the Sanskrit on whether the old school banga is the same as modern banga, this mixture of milk and cannabis, or wasn't even the same thing. Now let's go back to Asia. They say that cannabis has been grown in Asia as a crop for at least 12,000 years. And it was initially grown for its grain and its fiber. It was so popular, it started from Western China and moved to Central Asia. So not only did they use cannabis for its medicinal benefits, but they also used the hemp for its ropes, for clothing. Now in 700 BC, archaeologists actually evacuated some Yanghai tombs in northwestern China. And they dug up this in about the 2000s, and one tomb was from a shaman that dated back from 2,700 years ago. And it was said once they dug this grave up, he had a stash of cannabis buried with him. And they also confirmed that this cannabis did have evidence of THC in it. Now, if you don't know what THC is, it's the compound ingredient that actually gets us high or gives us that euphoric feeling. Now, again, the Chinese use hemp not only as medicine, but for rope, for food, for clothing, for shoes, and for paper. Kind of like now when we have all this rise of this hemp fabric, or even my youngest born, we bought him some hemp diapers. So the agents knew about this thousands of years ago, and they didn't just use cannabis just for as a drug or as a medicine, but also again for fabric, textiles, clothing, etc. Now they said it's also possible that cannabis was also used by the Assyrian, and they used it more as a aromatic. It was called, they say, quinabu. So to them, cannabis gave off this sweet smelling aroma that pleased themselves and pleased their gods as well. It's also been said that cannabis was used by the kingdom of Judah, the Israelites of the Bible, and they used it in their temple, and they said it was used in the anointing oil. Now, while this is also debated, I personally have not seen any scriptural evidence that is the case, but they have said that based on evidence, it's possible they did also use cannabis in their religious practices or rituals. Now, it is important to note, so far since we have seen cannabis in Asian cultures, in Indian cultures, in Israelite cultures, the main purpose of cannabis at this point is used as a medicine, or again, or a textile for clothing, shoes, rope, etc. We still haven't got to a point in society where we're using weed as just a fun drug or just for your own personal benefit or your enjoyment of, or just using it for the sake of benefiting off of the psychoactive. Now, while it is debated that some of the Asians did use it also for recreational purposes, it became more highly debated once cannabis was introduced to the Greeks, specifically Herodotus. Now, again, he started off using weed for its medicinal purpose, for spiritual purposes, for uses in religious or ritualistic acts. Now, they stated that Herodotus would bring groups of people together and they would smoke weed to not only ease whatever pain they were going through, but also so they could howl with pleasure, whatever that means. And it also said that it would also suppress sexual desire. Now, I've discussed in other videos, it works different for some people. Me, myself, weed was more so a stimulant for sex than suppressing my sexual appetite. But I have heard many guys that they smoke weed and they can't get it up. Now, going back to Asian culture, when they did a lot of evacuations of these tombs in Asia, it was said that wooden braziers were concentrated in more elite tombs. Yang's and Ren's team, they were the researchers, grounded bits of brazier into powder and applied gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to identify chemical compounds left behind. They found unusually high levels of THC compared with typical wild cannabis. Although much less than today's highly bred plants, the cannabis was apparently burned in an enclosed space, so mourners most certainly inhaled THC-laced fumes, making this the earliest solid evidence of cannabis use for its psychoactive purposes. So people in some of these cultures would use weed at funerals, basically. So they would have their ritual send-off of their loved ones and then burn some ganja, be in an enclosed space, and get that contact high. Now, it's interesting that even weed at its earlier state doesn't have the same amount of THC it has in today's plant. Now, while we abuse weed for its THC properties, cannabis in its early days had a low amount of THC, so it was more so used for its medicinal benefits than so much as psychoactive or psychotropic benefits, you can say, that we use it for now. So far in history, cannabis is a good thing. It's used, like I said, for medicinal benefits, used for clothes, for shoes, for rope. So when did we take a turn in society to where it started being banned, it started being illegal, it started being looked down on? Let's find out. Okay, I'm going to skip forward a lot of generations to colonial America, since primarily that's where I stay. So we're going to just focus on how we involved in Western society, specifically colonial America. Okay, so in the early 18th century, people were still using cannabis or hemp more so, as was still primarily used for clothing, for rope, for thread, for shoes, etc. Now, hemp was one of the first things that was cultivated in the early 18th century, specifically because hemp fibers are very strong and very durable. Colonel William Byrd II called this cultivation the darling of all my projects. Robert Beverly predicted it to be the greatest consequence to all of us. I'm not sure why he said that, but that's what he said. They said Thomas Jefferson left an acre on his property specifically just to grow hemp. Americans really, at this point, didn't use weed for its psychotropic elements. Primarily, it was used, again, for clothing, Of course, they were smoking tobacco, which they called the Indian weed. Hemp was cultivated from North America all the way to New England, all the way to Canada. It also could be grown in colder climates. But in the 18th century, Virginians and Marylanders grew hemp the most. There was an indigenous species of cannabis known as Indian hemp, but primarily Americans grew what we know today as cannabis sativa. Now, I mentioned it was grown by Thomas Jefferson, but it was also said that even George Washington and John Adams also grew hemp. Now, it even wasn't so much used for its medicinal properties. Now, they would sometimes boil the weed in milk to treat a common cold or cough or a headache, things like that. But as far as intoxication, people were not using weed recreationally. Now, if they did want to get a buzz or get a high, they would just drink alcohol. Or if they needed something medically to numb the pain or be a pain reliever, they would go to the strong stuff and use opium. Now, Britain and America would form alliances and trade different crops and different imports, and hemp was definitely one of them. Virginians specifically were permitted to pay taxes on their hemp crops. Now, what were some early restrictions on cannabis? Now, Americans and Europeans started to come in contact with cannabis consuming regions, so they started to actually use weed recreationally, or at least for medical purposes, but they were using it for things other than textiles, clothing, shoes, etc. After the invasion of Syria and Egypt in 1801, Napoleon actually banned cannabis use among his soldiers. Now, they say cannabis was introduced to Brazil either by the Portuguese or by the African slaves, but they, in the beginning, primarily used it for textiles and clothing. They started to use it psychoactively because supposedly the African slaves used it psychoactively, they say. For this reason, Brazil chose to make it illegal and punish any slave they caught using cannabis. Now, pushing to the start of the 20th century, more and more countries started to use cannabis, whether for clothing or whether for medicinal purposes. In the United States specifically, the first restriction of sale of cannabis came in the District of Columbia in 1906. So banned cannabis is actually, you can say, still relatively a new thing, only happening in the last little bit over a century. It was outlawed in Jamaica in 1913, which at that time it was a British colony. It was outlawed in South Africa in 1922. Cannabis was actually the #1 drug used in the United States until about 1863. Then it was replaced by morphine until morphine was replaced by aspirin in 1901. So basically before 1853, either if you had a headache, either you were high off weed or high off morphine. Sounds like a great time for me, if you ask me. Now, Williams Brooke O'Shaughnessy introduced cannabis to the Western civilization after living in India for a while. He pretty much is known as the main person who introduced cannabis to the Western civilization and noted how it was used for many therapeutic things, including stopping convulsions in children. Now, O'Shaughnessy tested weed on animals, on rats, on mice, even going to cows, to horses, etc. And after realizing how safe it was, he said, okay, I think it's safe for humans to ingest. So weed was I would say America was very pro-weed up into recent history. Now, although we're seeing laws that's banning the production as hemp as far as a textile, we do see in 1925 that cannabis is used in the U.S. pharmacopoeia, being used as tinctures, as oil, as herb abstracts in order to treat illnesses. Now, shortly after World War II, cannabis and other herbs were actually removed from the pharmacopoeia, and we don't really know for what concrete reason. It probably was more so for political reasons than so much considering weed to be the same thing as opium or narcotics. Okay, from the 18th to the 20th century, we still see weed used as a crop for clothing, for shoes, for textile, for rope. We also see it introduced into our medical system, used to treat illnesses, epilepsy, migraines, and so on. But where do we get to a point where we're starting to see it being restricted and we're starting to see people use it recreationally every day versus for its medicinal or functional properties? Let's find out.
Okay, so at this point, weed has become totally political in the Western states. Immigrants are coming in, they're pushing drugs, they're selling drugs, it's not being taxed. So at this point, between the 1920s and the 1930s, they come up with the marijuana tax law, which prohibits the sale and distribution of untaxed cannabis. Now, marijuana itself wasn't criminalized, but if it was used for unmedical purposes, then that was considered against the law. At this point also, recreational cannabis has become a thing in the U.S. Actually, California was the first state to make weed illegal. Of all places, seeing that they're so liberal and so freestyle, they were the first state in 1915 to make marijuana illegal. It then was considered a Scheduled 1 drug, which means it had no medical benefit, so it put it on the same level as heroin, crack, cocaine, etc. Now, during this time also, cannabis came prevalent with the use of jazz singers. So if you played jazz, whether in New York or wherever, weed became a major thing within that scene. Henry Anslinger and the Bureau of Narcotics basically started doing hit pieces on weed. They made weed this demon drug. It was bad for people, bad for humans. So they went on this all-out attack to try to limit the use of recreational marijuana. He believed that it was either used by immigrants, Mexicans, or worldly jazz singers, just not the common, average, hard-working American. And then we also get to a point where we start using cinema to work against weed. In 1936, they came out with Reefer Madness, originally called Tell Your Children. It's basically a melodramatic drama. They're pretty much painted weed in this horrible picture. If you smoke weed, you became crazy, insane, out of your mind. You will rob and kill and steal. You know, they made weed the same thing as alcohol or hard drugs. The film pretty much shaped a widespread Western view of cannabis, seen in much of a more negative light. The film kind of went away, then it got rediscovered in the 1970s when people were trying to fight the war against drugs and, you know, the battle of whether weed was a good thing or a bad thing. But speaking of the 1970s, that's when we see all these social, these political movements involving free love, speech, the hippies, and marijuana. Now, of course, we have war going on at this time. So really to combat the war, combat all these bad times like we are in now, we had this free love movement, which marijuana was at the center of it. So at this point, we're kind of seeing this black and white dynamic. One side says weed is bad, it's like crack, it's a hard drug. And you got the next one saying that it's, you know, it's this herb, it's a plant, it promotes peace, healing, love. So it's kind of the start of this battle between whether weed is a good thing or a bad thing. But take note, by this time we have stopped using weed as really a medical thing. It's more recreational, and also we have taken out of the use of spiritual religious practices. Not saying that it still didn't have these uses in other cultures, but here in America, pretty much it wasn't related to anything spiritual, although it still was used in the medical system, which it wasn't as widely known. Is more of a recreational thing at this point. So fast forward from the 70s to now, it's this, still to the day, it's this ongoing battle on whether weed is good for you, whether it's bad for you. Now, with the increase of depression, anxiety, social media in our society, we have seen an increase in weed use in the current day. Many new generation kids are pretty much turned their nose up at alcohol, which is good. Alcohol is definitely, if used in high amounts, is definitely more deadly, worse than weed. But millennials and Gen Z and after, they're replacing alcohol with weed, with mushrooms, with psychedelics, and weed in particular. So although weed is a good medical substitution, is it something that our children should be doing in higher quantities than alcohol? You know, there's nothing wrong if you have a drink every now and then and replace that with a joint. You know, what's the big deal? But we get to a point now where teens are smoking weed every single day. We have edibles, making it easier for people to use weed, and most of them are not using it medically. It's pretty much for recreational. They may say it's medical because it helps with their depression, their anxiety. So, and not saying it doesn't have a place for these things, but we've gotten to a point in society where we're using weed as a crutch rather than using it for its benefits it was intended for in the beginning of time. From 1973, in states like Texas, Oregon, Alaska, Maine, we start seeing weed being decriminalized. As far as medical cannabis, starting in 1996, states like California, Oregon, Maine, Hawaii, Nevada are starting to legalize medical marijuana. So it's starting to come back into our society used for medical purposes. Starting in 2012 with Colorado, we are now seeing the legalization of recreational marijuana, and there's many states to follow, from Vermont to New Hampshire, Illinois to Utah, Maryland, Kentucky, Minnesota, and Ohio as late as 2023. So, do you see a cultural shift in the change in marijuana from 2,000 years ago up into now, where we're not using it for, like I said, religious practices? We're not using, although it is used in medical system, and not saying it shouldn't be replaced with some pharmaceutical drugs, most people who are smoking weed are not using them for medical purposes. They're using it because they just like the feeling of being high. So has weed became an issue, or are we embracing it for what it once was in history? I don't know. We're still trying to figure this out. So if you have some ideas, if you have some info, if you have some information that would forward this conversation, please comment below. I just want to do this brief video on the history of weed, starting from its first documented use to its use right now in our Western society. Until next time, guys, please like, subscribe, share. Most importantly, comment below. Until next time, guys, remember, we are all in this together. Peace.
What's up, guys? I don't try to be political on this channel. I don't try to be racial. It's about weed addiction, but I'm black. We're talking about weed. We're in a political climate right now, so I mean, what the hell? So apparently, disclaimer, I'm not a supporter of any sides. I don't vote. To some who may say, oh, you don't vote, you think this is a game? Yes, I do think this is a game. That's why I don't vote. But there is one particular side that I feel like is the worser of evils. The side that always plays identity politics. So now we're approaching 2 weeks from the election, and I guess they're in panic mode. So I guess they decide 2 weeks before, let's target black men. I guess since black women don't really like her that much. So I guess they're trying to target us now. And apparently, as a black man, all I want is weed and loans to start a business. That's her rebuttal to everything. If you ask about inflation, on prices rising, a thing that affects everybody, no matter what your skin color or your orientation is. And then we talk about getting a small business loan. a first-time house buyer's loan for no more than between 10 and 25,000, which for a house really ain't shit. And as far as a business, okay, what if I don't want to start a business? What if I just want to work my 9 to 5 that I'm currently working and just not go to the store and pay $1 million for eggs? Why is it we have to get a loan for everything? I don't get it. But they're panicking. Black men don't like her. I don't really like her. I don't think anybody likes her. So what is she going to do for black men? Now, of course, you should know her old job as a prosecutor. She sent a lot of black men to jail for weed. Now, rather than her addressing that and apologizing to the black man for sending many of us to jail for weed, whether we had a small amount or we were selling small amounts, rather than her apologizing for her past and try to come up with, I don't really know what they will come up with to appeal to black men, but rather than her addressing her main issue with black men, she said, well, I want to legalize recreational marijuana, which I think that's important, not medical, because again, I think that they want us smoking weed so we can be blind and be numb to what's actually going on. So she wants to legalize recreational marijuana, which I'm like, okay, so I guess all black men just want to smoke weed, and give us loans for our business, which I'm like, I don't want to start a business. I already have a job. I just want cheaper eggs and cheaper gas. But apparently if I'm black, I want loans. I want to smoke weed. I don't know. I want to be a rapper, I suppose, or I want to be, I don't know or maybe I want to open my weed business, because apparently weed and money, that's how you appeal to black men. So I feel like that as a black man, that is a slap in one's face, very demeaning, really just narrowing us down to basically weed and money 2 weeks before the election. Like, could we have thought of a better plan? Could we thought of a better approach? So I think white men don't like her either, and black men don't, but I think that was a very cheap attack, cheap shot, and very ill plan to try to bring us back to the Democratic side. So, as I said, I've made previous videos about what I think the Democrats do to keep us blind, keep us numb to what's going on. And I'm like, 2 weeks before the election, it's getting worse. Like, just address that you sent a lot of black men to jail for weed, but no, we want to legalize weed for you and give you money, which in turn will make us experience more inflation in the economy. As somebody who smoked weed for 15 years of my life, I've never had an issue with getting weed. I wish the government would legalize weed so I could get weed. I never had a problem with getting weed to smoke. Most drug dealers I know did not have a problem with finding weed to sell. Is that really an issue for us? If we want to smoke weed, we can find weed, whether it's legal or whether it's not. I don't want a loan. I want cheaper eggs, cheaper gas. But I just want to hop on. Like I said, I'm not very political, but I just find it hilarious, the shenanigans and stunts that they're trying to pull out 2 weeks before the election. And like I said, apparently as a black man, all I want is weed and loan.